He laughed at the janitor's shoes mocking them, certain the man was beneath him. But what he didn't know was that those same worn-out shoes had walked a path greater than his imagination. Because the man he ridiculed in front of everyone was the very founder of the school he called his own. A single laugh would soon turn into the lesson of a lifetime. And it all began the very first time Ethan dared to make a joke at the janitor's expense. The first week of a new school year always carried a certain energy at Arden Hill Academy. The kind of energy you could almost feel in the air, buzzing, restless, sharp. The polished marble floors gleamed under the weight of expensive shoes. The walls, lined with portraits of old alumni and benefactors, seemed to whisper stories of legacy, money, and privilege. This was no ordinary school. It was a fortress of prestige, a place where the children of bankers, surgeons, and politicians came to secure their future. And among them was Ethan. Ethan carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. His father was one of the Academy's largest donors, his family name printed on plaques in the library and the sports complex. Teachers spoke to him carefully. Other students gravitated toward him, and Ethan thrived on the attention. He loved being noticed. He loved being heard. And then there was Mr. Thomas. Most students hardly noticed him at all. He was the man in the gray uniform, the man who moved quietly through the hallways with a broom or a mop, the man who made sure the trash bins never overflowed. To the students, he was just the janitor. But there was something about him that stood out to those who actually paid attention. He carried himself differently, not like a man beaten down by his work, but like someone who had chosen it. His steps were steady, purposeful. He didn't shuffle, he didn't drag his feet. And though his uniform was plain, his shoes drew eyes whenever someone looked close enough. They were old, not just slightly worn, but deeply used. The leather was cracked, the soles uneven, and the stitching bore tiny repairs as though he'd mended them by hand. Yet, every morning those same shoes were polished until they shone faintly under the fluorescent lights. It was almost as if he was determined to keep them alive, no matter how much time tried to wear them down. For Ethan, those shoes were not a symbol of dignity. They were an opportunity. One afternoon, between classes, Ethan spotted Mr. Thomas sweeping near the trophy case. He was surrounded by a group of his friends, each one eager to laugh at his jokes, to cheer him on. Ethan's eyes drifted downward, and a cruel smirk crossed his face. "Would you look at that?" Ethan said loudly, pointing. "Those things belong in a museum. I swear, my grandfather's slippers look newer than those shoes." His friends erupted into laughter, a cruel chorus that filled the hallway. One of them added, "Maybe we should take up a collection for him. Get the poor guy something that doesn't fall apart when it rains." More laughter followed. Ethan basked in it. He loved the sound of people laughing with him, even if it meant laughing at someone else. But Mr. Thomas didn't react. He paused for the briefest moment, leaning slightly on his broom. His eyes flickered, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with something unreadable. Then he simply went back to sweeping, his movements calm and measured, as though Ethan's words had never touched him at all. The silence that followed was strange. Ethan's friends kept laughing, but a few students passing by exchanged glances. One girl frowned, another boy hesitated before joining in the laughter. And the teachers, those who witnessed it, said nothing, but their eyes lingered a little longer on Mr. Thomas. Ethan mistook that silence as victory. To him, it meant the man was too weak to stand up for himself. too invisible to matter. But silence can be heavier than words. Silence can hold patience. Silence can hold truths. And in Mr. Thomas, silence that day was something none of those laughing students could understand. What Ethan didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that those worn-out shoes carried more history, more sacrifice, and more power than his family donations ever would. That day, Ethan thought he had scored a moment of popularity. In reality, he had just stepped into a story that would unravel everything he thought he knew. And soon, that cruel little joke wouldn't stay between a few friends. It would spread through the school like wildfire, until whispers began to twist into questions Ethan could no longer ignore. By the next morning, Ethan's joke had already taken on a life of its own. At Arden Hill Academy, gossip moved like a current beneath the polished floors and chandelier-lit halls. It didn't take long before the words he had thrown out so carelessly the day before were being repeated in every corner of the school. In the cafeteria line, students nudged each other and whispered about the janitor's museum shoes. At the lunch tables, they leaned close and repeated Ethan's exact words, each voice carrying a smug little smirk. Some even began to embellish the story, adding new twists and fresh insults. By the end of the day, the joke had been told so many times that Mr. Thomas's shoes were no longer just shoes, they had become the newest punchline of the campus. And Ethan loved every second of it. He strutted through the corridors like a performer taking a bow. His friends reminded him how sharp he was, how fearless he looked standing in the hallway mocking the janitor in front of everyone. To them, it was nothing but harmless entertainment. Just another cruel game played at the expense of someone they all believed was invisible. But not everyone was laughing. Some students sat in silence as the jokes flew, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others glanced at Mr. Thomas when he passed by, their eyes heavy with something more complicated than amusement. For them, the laughter carried a sting. They knew too well what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be dismissed before anyone even bothered to know their story. Maya was one of those students. Maya was at Arden Hill on scholarship. Her parents worked long hours at a diner and a warehouse just to give her this chance at a better education. She was bright, hard-working, but she was also surrounded by classmates who reminded her every day that she didn't come from money. When Ethan's joke spread like wildfire, Maya didn't find it clever or funny. She found it cruel. She started noticing things Ethan and his friends were too blind to see. The way Mr. Thomas carried himself was not like a man beaten down by years of labor. There was no bitterness in his stride, no defeat in the way he moved. His steps were steady, deliberate, almost as if every sweep of his broom had a purpose. And the teachers noticed him too. They nodded when he passed. Some greeted him by name. Even the headmaster, who was known for his cold and formal demeanor, greeted Mr. Thomas with warmth. There was respect there, subtle but undeniable. It was the kind of respect that couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. But Ethan never saw any of that. He doubled down, louder and more persistent than before. Whenever he spotted Mr. Thomas, he made sure everyone else noticed too. In gym class, he joked that the janitor's shoes must weigh 100 pounds, that walking in them was probably more exhausting than lifting. The school's weights. In history, he doodled a cartoon of boots falling apart, passing it down the row while his friends stifled their laughter. Even when no one asked, Ethan brought it up again and again, each time making the joke crueler, as though he wanted to prove that no silence could withstand his voice. And still, Mr. Thomas never reacted. He would pause for a moment, maybe glance at Ethan, maybe not. Then he would return to his work with the same calm patience. His silence was steady, unshakable, and it began to eat at Ethan. The lack of response wasn't a victory anymore, it was a wall. And no matter how loud he laughed, that wall never cracked. But Ethan wasn't the only one watching. The older teachers, the ones who had been at Arden Hill for decades, exchanged quiet looks whenever Ethan's mockery echoed through the halls. They didn't scold him, not directly, but their silence was different from Mr. Thomas. It wasn't passive. It wasn't weakness. It was more like waiting, as if they knew something Ethan didn't. As if they were watching a boy laugh at a storm cloud, not realizing it was about to break open above his head. The whispers in the hallways began to change. At first, it was just the joke repeated again and again. But soon, students began to ask questions. Why did the headmaster speak to the janitor with more warmth than he used with most parents? Why did the oldest staff members always seem to treat him with an unusual level of respect? And why, of all people, did this man walk through the halls like he had nothing to prove, as though he belonged there more than anyone else? Ethan brushed the questions aside. He didn't want to hear them. To him, the janitor was nothing more than a man in old shoes and easy target, a prop in his show of arrogance. What he didn't realize was that every cruel laugh, every careless insult, was pushing him closer to a truth that would strip away everything he thought he understood about the man in those shoes. And soon, that truth would begin to surface. Not through gossip, not through laughter, but through the preparations for the school's most important event of the year, Founders' Day. At Arden Hill Academy there were many traditions, but none as grand or as sacred as Founders' Day. For more than 4 decades, it had been the pinnacle of the school year, a day when the entire institution paused to honor its origins and the man whose vision had created it. Students spoke of it with a mix of excitement and dread. Parents circled it on their calendars, knowing it was the one day when the academy put its prestige on display for the world to see. In the weeks leading up to the event, the school transformed. The custodial staff buffed the marble floors until they shone like mirrors, reflecting the golden light of chandeliers that hung high above the atrium. Teachers stayed late decorating classrooms and corridors with garlands of ivy and banners embroidered with the school's crest. The orchestra rehearsed tirelessly in the auditorium, the notes of violins, trumpets, and timpani rolling like thunder down the hallways long after the sun had set. The very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were preparing for the spectacle. The ceremony was not just about honoring history. It was also about reaffirming the hierarchy. Parents and donors filled the front rows, their jewelry glittering under the stage lights. Students lined up in starched uniforms, their shoes polished, their hair neatly combed. Every detail mattered, because Founders' Day wasn't simply a celebration. It was a performance of power, a reminder of who belonged at Arden Hill and who was merely trying to survive within its walls. And at the center of all these preparations was Mr. Thomas. He was everywhere. Early in the morning, before most students even arrived, he was already in the auditorium, testing microphones, arranging chairs, hauling boxes of programs from the print room to the stage. In the afternoons, when other staff members had gone home, he could be seen checking the lighting rigs, ensuring the banners hung perfectly straight, and making sure not a single scuff marked the polished wood of the stage floor. His work was invisible to most, but without him, the grand event would have been chaos. To Maya, the scholarship student who had noticed the peculiar way teachers treated him, It was striking. She watched how his hands moved with precision, how he didn't just set chairs, he measured the distance between them, aligning each row with a craftsman's eye. He didn't just polish brass railings, he made sure every reflection gleamed evenly, as though he wanted the room to shine with pride. There was something in the way he worked, a kind of reverence, as though this wasn't just another school event for him. It was personal. But to Ethan, it was just another chance to make himself the center of attention. One afternoon, as Mr. Thomas bent down to adjust a crooked chair leg, Ethan leaned against the doorway of the auditorium with his usual circle of friends. His voice, dripping with arrogance, echoed across the room. "Careful with those relics, old man," he sneered. "If those shoes give out during the assembly, well, I'll have to carry you off the stage." The boys erupted in laughter. The sound bounced off the walls, sharp and cruel. One added, "Maybe we should add him to the display of historical artifacts." Right between the founder's shovel and the old crest. More laughter. Ethan smirked, proud of himself, certain he had delivered another unforgettable line. A teacher passing by stopped in her tracks. Her eyes snapped to Ethan, sharp with disapproval. For a moment it seemed as though she might say something. But then, just as quickly, she looked away and continued walking. The silence was worse than scolding, it was enabling. Ethan mistook it as permission. But what happened next unsettled him in a way no laughter ever could. Mr. Thomas straightened slowly, brushing dust from his uniform. He didn't glance at Ethan, nor did he acknowledge the cruel remark. Instead, his gaze shifted upward, toward the wall near the stage entrance. Hanging there was a framed photograph, an old black-and-white image from the Academy's early years. It showed the school in its infancy, half-built walls surrounded by scaffolding, a handful of men standing proudly with the tools in their hands. And there, at the center of the photograph, was a young man gripping a shovel, his expression steady, determined. His clothes were plain, his hands calloused, but his stance radiated purpose. What caught Ethan's eye wasn't the shovel. It wasn't even the young man's face. It was the shoes. They were strikingly similar to the ones Mr. Thomas wore now. The shape, the stitching, the sturdy build it was uncanny. In the faded photo they looked new, but there was no mistaking the resemblance. For a split second, Ethan felt something he wasn't used to feeling: doubt. He looked back at Mr. Thomas, who was still staring at the photo. His eyes softened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and for just a moment, his entire face carried the weight of memory. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he turned back to his work. He picked up the broom, adjusted the chairs once more, and carried on as though nothing had happened. The moment was so subtle that most students missed it. His friends, still laughing, didn't notice at all. But Ethan noticed, and for reasons he couldn't explain, the joke no longer felt as satisfying as it had before. Why would a janitor look at that photograph with such intensity? Why would he linger on it, as though he saw himself in its faded lines? The thought gnawed at Ethan, but he shoved it down quickly, forcing himself to laugh even louder, drowning his own unease. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a seed of suspicion had been planted. Founders' Day was coming. The truth, buried in silence for years, was about to step into the light. And when it did, Ethan's laughter would be the very thing that came back to haunt him. And the first clue to that truth wouldn't come from the stage or the staffet, would be hidden in the dusty archives of the school, where a single photograph would begin to unravel everything Ethan thought he knew. The countdown to Founders' Day was on. With every passing day, Arden Hill Academy seemed to hum louder with expectation. The banners that hung across the courtyard rippled in the autumn wind. The school orchestra's music echoed long into the evenings, and the headmaster's tone grew sharper with every rehearsal. For the wealthy families of Arden Hill, it was more than a school event. It was a stage for reputation, pride, and power. But beneath the polish, whispers still lingered. Whispers about Mr. Thomas. Maya couldn't ignore them anymore. She'd always paid more attention than most. She'd noticed how the teachers spoke to him with respect, how even the headmaster, who rarely lowered himself to casual conversation, treated the janitor like an equal. She'd seen the way Mr. Thomas carried himself, with dignity, with calm, with a kind of silent authority that didn't match the role he played. And, most of all, she remembered the way he had stared at that old photograph in the auditorium. His gaze so heavy, so filled with memory, that she couldn't shake it from her mind. So, when she was asked to volunteer in the archives to help organize old photographs and documents for a Founders' Day display, she didn't hesitate. The archives were hidden deep in the basement, behind a heavy oak door that smelled faintly of dust and varnish. Most students didn't even know the room existed. Inside, rows of metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stacked with boxes of files, ledgers, and photographs so old that their edges had curled. The air was cool and dry, carrying the musty scent of paper that had been waiting decades to be touched again. Maya felt small in that room, as though she were standing in the presence of ghosts. Each box carried fragments of stories, forgotten ceremonies, long-graduated students, the earliest days of the school when Arden Hill was still more dream than fortress. She moved carefully, as though afraid to disturb the slumbering history. At first, her task was simple: sort through old programs and pull anything relevant to Founders' Day. But as her hands moved through yellowed pages and brittle pamphlets, she stumbled across a photograph that made her stop cold. It was the same image she'd seen in the auditorium: the half-built school, scaffolding rising against the sky, and a group of workers standing proudly in front of it. They were rough men, hands calloused, faces smudged with dirt, but there was something heroic in the way they stood proud of what they were building. Her eyes locked on the young man at the center. He wasn't dressed in a suit like a wealthy donor. He wasn't holding a pen or a contract. He was gripping a shovel, his sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the fabric at his chest. His expression was steady, determined, as though he could already see the future of the school rising from the bricks. And then she noticed his shoes. They were sturdy leather boots, the kind built for work, not for show. In the photo, they looked new shining faintly even through the faded black and white. But the shape, the stitching, the thickness of the soles, they were unmistakably similar to the shoes Mr. Thomas wore every day. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned the photo over. On the back, written in looping, careful script, were the words, Thomas Rowan, Breaking Ground. 1979. Maya froze. Her heart raced. She read the words again and again, as though repetition might change them. Thomas Rowan. That was his name. And the man in the picture, the man breaking ground with a shovel in his hand, wasn't just anyone. He was Mr. Thomas, the janitor. But if the photo was correct, if this really was him, then he wasn't just a janitor. He was there at the beginning. He was the one who had built Arden Hill from the ground up. Her hands trembled as she held the photo. Suddenly, all the pieces began clicking together. The respect from the teachers, the warmth from the headmaster, the silence, the patience, the dignity in his eyes. It wasn't just humility. It was ownership. He didn't need to prove himself, he already was the foundation of the school. Just then, the heavy oak door creaked open. Maya jumped, clutching the photo. Ethan stepped into the archives, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He carried a box under one arm, his expression sour. "Figures," he muttered, dropping the box on the nearest table with a thud. "The scholarship kids get the fun jobs, while I get stuck hauling junk." Maya shot him a sharp look. "It's not junk. It's history." Ethan rolled his eyes, then noticed the photo in her hands. His curiosity piqued. He sauntered closer, snatching it out of her grip before she could react. "Hey," she snapped, but Ethan ignored her. He studied the picture, his smirk already forming. "Well, would you look at that? More dusty relics." "Oh, wait, look at those shoes." He pointed with mock amusement. "Don't tell me the founder had the same bad taste as the janitor." He chuckled at his own joke, but then he flipped the photo over. His smirk faltered. His eyes scanned the writing. "Thomas Rowan," he whispered. His voice was softer now, uncertain. He looked back at the man in the photograph, then back at Maya. His arrogance cracked just slightly. "You don't think Maya's eyes blazed?" "I do think, and if you weren't so busy mocking him, you might have noticed what everyone else already has." Ethan scoffed, defensive. "That's ridiculous. A janitor? The founder of Arden Hill? Impossible." But his voice wavered. He shoved the photo back into the box a little too quickly, as though trying to bury what he had just seen. Yet, even as he tried to dismiss it, the doubt gnawed at him. The resemblance was undeniable. The name was exact. The shoes were the same. He left the archives more quietly than he had entered, his usual swagger dulled. For the first time, Ethan wasn't laughing. He was rattled. Maya stayed behind, her heart still pounding. She looked again at the photograph, her eyes tracing the face of the young man in the center. She whispered the name under her breath. Thomas Rowan, the janitor, the builder, the founder. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that on Founders' Day the truth would no longer be hidden in dusty archives. It would step into the light for everyone to see. The day of the assembly was fast approaching, and with it, the moment when the man in those shoes would finally stand before the entire school. Not as a janitor, but as its true founder. Founders' Day dawned clear and cool. The kind of morning that made Arden Hill Academy look like a postcard. The lawns were clipped to a perfect green. The flag hung motionless against a sky the color of polished glass, and the stone buildings stood tall and self-assured, as if they had always belonged to this hill and always would. Before the first bell, the front drive filled with glossy cars that moved like chess pieces slow, precise, expensive. Parents stepped out in dark suits and quiet jewelry, greeting one another with familiar smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Students hurried past them in pressed uniforms, forming neat lines that swelled into streams headed for the auditorium. The day felt staged, choreographed, inevitable. Inside, the auditorium thrummed with preparation. The student orchestra tuned in layered waves violins, testing thin, bright notes, brass clearing their throats into low gold hums, percussionists rolling a fingertip across drumheads to feel the tension. The lighting crew set cues, one square of brightness at a time. Teachers moved between rows, leaving programs on every other seat. A cream card with gold edging, the school crest stamped at the top, the order of ceremony printed in a serif font that tried very hard to sound important. On the stage, a podium stood center, flanked by banners and a single glass case containing artifacts from the Academy's earliest years, an iron trowel, a photograph, a coil-bound ledger with the first donor names inked in a careful hand. Mr. Thomas was there long before the orchestra tuned its first note. He walked the aisles with a clipboard and a roll of blue painter's tape, correcting what only he could see. A chair edge was nudged a half-inch to make the row perfect. A cable was taped down where a heel could catch. A banner cord was untwisted so the crest hung true. And those shoes, the shoes that had been mocked and passed around as a joke, had been polished before dawn. The leather was still creased and stitched with years, but it carried a quiet, even shine, like the way a lake takes the light without begging for it. A younger custodian paused near him and asked if he wanted help carrying the last stack of programs to the aisle tables. Mr. Thomas thanked him, not with perfunctory warmth, but the kind that lands and stays. He set the programs down, squared their corners, and let his palm rest against the table a moment longer than necessary, as if checking the day for steadiness. Ethan arrived with his father, who wore the event like a suit fitted to his bones. The elder man shook hands with other donors in practiced rhythm, trading compliments about endowments and expansions as if they were scores in a game only they knew how to play. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder for the optics of it. "Sit, front row," he murmured, eyes never leaving the headmaster crossing the aisle. "Smile when appropriate. No nonsense today." Ethan nodded, his throat oddly tight. He had slept poorly, a dream of a shovel slicing into earth returning again and again. It wasn't fear, he told himself. It was adrenaline, the good kind, the kind you feel before a win. Maya took a seat mid-row with other student volunteers, her program folded open across her lap. She looked down the order. Processional, welcome. Headmaster's remarks, orchestra interlude, a word on origins, student address, award presentations, closing. A word on origins had no name beside it. She checked twice to be sure. Someone had removed it, or it had never been there at all. Her eyes drifted to the stage, to the glass case with the trowel and the ledger and the photograph. Even from halfway back, she could see the young man at the center of the picture, shirt sleeves rolled, the set of his jaw steady as a line drawn by a ruler. She thought of the inscription she'd held in her hands the day before. Thomas Rowan, Breaking Ground, 1979. The headmaster walked onto the stage before the house opened. He wore a carnation at his lapel, a detail he saved for this day every year. He stopped at the podium and slid a single page from his inner pocket. Its edges were bent from handling, the creases smoothed with a thumb. Mr. Thomas approached the foot of the stage and stood still, hands folded behind his back. The two men looked at one another for a long beat that belonged to neither schedule nor script. The headmaster inclined his head first, a small bow that would be invisible from most seats. Mr. Thomas gave a nod in return and let his gaze slide to the glass case. A key lay there, too, small and plain, threaded on a black cord. It hadn't been in the case the night before. He knew because he had locked the cabinet himself. When the doors opened, the auditorium filled in layers, trustees and donors down front, faculty clustered along the aisle ends like islands, students pouring into the middle like a tide. The house lights softened, and the stage lights lifted to a quiet dawn. The orchestra's processional unfurled with a kind of ceremonial gravity that told everyone exactly how to behave. At the end of the aisle, small committees of student ushers guided stragglers to open seats with urgent smiles. Programs fluttered. Phones went dark. The headmaster stepped to the podium, and the hall exhaled into stillness. "Welcome," he began, and the words settled over the room like a velvet cloth. He talked about tradition and continuity in sentences that had been rehearsed until they sounded like they belonged to him. He thanked the donors for their stewardship, the faculty for their devotion, and the students for their promise. He told a brief story about the Academy's earliest days, when there were no banners and only one building that leaked from every seam when it rained. The audience laughed at the right places, the practiced relief of people whose role for the day was to be pleased. He turned one page and found the line that wasn't on the public program. "This morning," he said, "we are honored to hear a word on origins, not from a stranger to our halls, but from someone whose steps have crossed this floor more often than any of us." A rustle moved through the room, the smallest shift of posture that runs like wind in wheat. Ethan sat straighter, eyes flicking toward the wings. He couldn't see anyone there. He told himself that someone whose steps have crossed this floor was a flourish, a metaphor, a decorative handle on a plain drawer. Maya didn't think so. She felt the muscles in her shoulders pull tight, as if bracing against an unseen wave. She glanced down at the photograph in the program insert. Just a tiny reproduction, nearly an ornament, and back up at the glass case holding the original. The orchestra offered an interlude, a short, bright piece that kept the air moving while the stagehands adjusted the microphone and the headmaster arranged the single-page script to the side. During the music, two things happened that only the observant caught. At the back of the room, 3 retired teachers' men and women no longer on the payroll but never far from school events stood as if on cue. They did not clap, they did not whisper. They simply stood, faces turned to the stage, eyes bright with a look that was equal parts pride and relief. And at the side door near the stage, Mr. Thomas stepped into the shadowed wing, not hiding, not making an entrance, but waiting with the kind of patience that has a spine. Ethan felt heat climb the back of his neck. Something about the standing teachers irritated him, too reverent, too in the know, like being excluded from a joke told in plain sight. He acknowledged the feeling and stuffed it under his ribs the way he always did with anything inconvenient. His father leaned forward, palm on the back of the seat in front of him. "Eyes front," he murmured. And the reflex in Ethan's spine obeyed. When the interlude ended, silence did not fall so much as settle. The headmaster did not resume his place behind the podium. He stood beside it and laid a hand on the glass case. "We keep artifacts," he said, "to remind ourselves that our comfort was once someone else's labor. We would do well to let that memory remain sharp." He lifted the case lid and took out the small key on the black cord. He didn't raise it high, didn't display it like a prize. He held it at sternum level, the way one might hold a locket found in a drawer after years. "Keys open doors," he continued. "They also keep promises." A murmur rippled and faded. Ethan shifted in his seat. He had, without noticing, stopped blinking. 2 rows back, Maya pressed her palms together between her knees to keep from fidgeting. On the far aisle, a very old man who had once coached track wiped his cheek with the back of his hand and laughed at himself for it. The headmaster returned the key to the case and stepped back. He didn't announce a name. He didn't announce a title. He said simply, "Please welcome a man whose first gift to Arden Hill was not money, but sweat. Whose first office was not an office at all, but a scaffold and a muddy yard. A man whose steps have shaped these floors from the day they were poured." His voice softened, but did not tremble. "Please welcome him." No spotlight swung. No curtain flew. Mr. Thomas walked out from the wing with the same measured pace he used to cross a hallway with a mop bucket. He wore the same gray uniform. He wore the same shoes. He did not lift his chin, but he did not lower it either. At first, nothing happened. And then, because recognition is rarely a lightning strike and more often the slow ignition of tinder, the audience began to stand. Not all at once. Not because someone told them to. A teacher in the back row. A parent on the aisle. A student with a hand over her mouth. The retirees who had stood long before stayed standing without moving a muscle. The sound that followed was not applause in the usual sense. It was softer, ragged at the edge, the kind of clapping people do when they aren't sure if they are allowed to cry. Ethan's body did not obey him. He felt himself stand because the row stood, because not standing would have exposed something more naked than his confusion. He watched Mr. Thomas cross the stage and take his place at the podium. He noted, because habit is stubborn, the way the left shoe dipped a fraction more than the right with each step, as if the sole had been patched and patched again. He waited for someone to correct the absurdity, some adult to step in and say there had been a mistake. No one did. Mr. Thomas rested both hands on either side of the podium, as if steadying a table he had built himself. He looked out over the room and, for a long breath, said nothing. Not the silence of a man with no words. The silence of a man choosing the first word carefully because he knows words can move weight if they are placed right. He glanced to the glass case. The photograph caught the light and handed it back. In the third row, Ethan's father clapped 3 neat times and stopped, as if the ritual portion of his duty had ended, and something less obvious was being asked of him. Ethan tried to find anger, and came up with something else. A thin, high wire of dread that hummed in the bones behind his ears. He remembered the archives and the looping script on the back of an old photograph. He remembered Maya's voice, its history, and wished he had not mocked it. Maya leaned forward so slightly she might as well have been falling. She could not have said what she expected to hear. She only knew that this was the hinge. The day turned on it. The school turned on it. Perhaps she did too. Mr. Thomas drew a breath that reached his shoulders and returned them to their place. Then he spoke, and the first sentence landed with the weight of a beam set true. "Good morning." The microphones made nothing of it. They carried his voice as if it had its own power, and they were simply air. He did not announce a name. He did not announce a claim. He let the room measure the man before it measured the story. He looked out over faces he had watched change from freshman to senior, and from student to parent, and from colleague to memory. He lifted one hand and let it fall to the wood, a gentle tap that made a soft, certain sound in the hush. Ethan closed his eyes in reflex and opened them again. He felt the ground tilt in the smallest measurable way, like a boat finding the true current after bobbing in a wake. He didn't know yet what would be said. He only knew his laugh had no place to go. It had nowhere left to live. The headmaster stepped back 2 paces and left the space clear. The orchestra, without signal, grew so still it seemed carved. The donors were quiet in their cufflinks and pearls. The students held their programs flat against their knees. In the wings, a younger custodian stood with a hand on the proscenium wall, eyes shining as if seeing a story he had been told his first week now, walk onto the stage and breathe. Mr. Thomas let the second sentence come. "I was here when this floor was poured." The room did not gasp. It did something more honest. It listened with its whole body. He touched the podium again, as if feeling the grain. He looked at the banner, the trowel, the key. Then he lifted his eyes and found, without searching, the exact center of the room, where a boy and a girl sat like anchors in the sea of faces. Ethan in the front rows, barrel-chested with a name he had been told to carry. Maya midway back, hands folded so tight her knuckles ached. He did not hold their gaze. He visited it, like a craftsman visiting a room years after he hung the door, checking if it still swings true. Ethan swallowed. The auditorium felt suddenly larger and closer at once. Around him, the familiar architecture of Arden Hill the crest. The banners, the carved phrase over the proscenium looked different, as if age had lifted a thin film off the surface and revealed the rawness beneath. The phrase read, "Sic ider ad astra." So we go to the stars. He had always liked how high it sounded. He had never asked what road you take to get there. Mr. Thomas's fingers stilled on the wood. The next words waited like tools laid out on a bench chosen, within reach, ready. And then the lights held, the room breathed in, and the story-act last began to open. In the next moment, the man they called the janitor will tell them how the school was truly built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, and why he chose to keep wearing the same pair of shoes. The applause that had greeted Mr. Thomas's arrival slowly ebbed away, but the silence it left behind was not ordinary. It wasn't the silence of boredom, nor the silence of waiting for a speech to end. It was heavy, reverent, like the hush that settles over a cathedral when light streams through stained glass. Every face was turned toward the man at the podium, the man they had passed in hallways without a glance, the man whose shoes had been the punchline of so many cruel jokes, the man who, in this moment, seemed to stand taller than the banners, taller than the walls, taller even than the name Arden Hill Academy itself. Mr. Thomas rested his weathered hands on the wood of the podium. The fingers were thick and calloused, scarred in places, but steady. His uniform looked plain under the stage lights, the gray fabric washed from years of use. His shoes, those battered, patched, scuffed shoes, caught the light with a faint sheen, not of wealth, but of history. They stood as quiet proof that time had passed through them without breaking them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deep, and carried not the urgency of someone trying to be heard, but the weight of someone who expected to be. "I was here," he said, "when the first stone was laid." The words landed with such force that people leaned forward without realizing they had moved. A murmur swept the room. Parents glanced at one another, eyebrows furrowed. Some students tilted their heads in confusion, but the teachers, those who had seen Mr. Thomas day after day, year after year, sat utterly still. Some already had tears in their eyes. "This hill," Mr. Thomas continued, letting the silence between his words stretch long and heavy, "was nothing but earth and wind when I first walked it. There were no marble floors, no banners, no shining lights, just mud underfoot, rough sketches on paper, and a dream too heavy for most to carry." He paused, eyes scanning the room. "They told me it couldn't be done, that the ground was too rough, that no parent would send their child here, so far from the city. They told me the vision was foolish." His jaw tightened ever so slightly. But I believed. His voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction. I carried the bricks, I lifted the beams, I laid the tile. I worked until my hands bled and my back ached. And when the day was over and the other workers had gone home, I stayed. I swept the floors. I patched the walls. I fixed what was broken, because I wasn't just building a school, I was building a promise. The hall was silent again, but it was not an empty silence. It was full of pictures his words painted, of a man toiling under sun and rain, pouring his strength into walls that would one day hold generations of students. Ethan sat frozen, every word like a stone pressing deeper into his chest. He couldn't stop seeing the cartoons he had drawn, the cruel laughter he had led. Each memory now felt like a slap echoing back at him. His face burned with shame. Mr. Thomas' eyes softened as he looked toward the rows of students. I did not stay here as a man of titles. I did not need my name carved into stone. I stayed because I wanted to remember, to walk these halls every day and see with my own eyes whether the promise I made was being kept, whether this school was raising not only scholars but people of character, whether it was producing not just ambition, but humility. He paused, then slowly lifted one foot and let it settle back onto the wood of the stage with a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have. His gaze hardened. And these shoes. He let the words hang, daring the audience to look. These are the same shoes I wore the day I laid that first stone. They trudged through mud when the foundations were poured. They waded through sawdust as the beams rose. They have carried me through storms, through snow, through 40 years of this school's history. His voice lowered, each syllable sharp as a blade. Yes, they are scuffed. Yes, they are patched. Yes, they are old. But they carry the story of Arden Hill. They carry my story. And stories, he said, his eyes locking onto the front rows, are worth far more than polish. The words struck the room like thunder. For years, those shoes had been a punchline. Now they were transformed, suddenly sacred, a symbol of resilience, endurance, and sacrifice. Parents stared at them as though seeing them for the first time. Students swallowed hard, the laughter they once shared now tasting bitter in their mouths. Teachers bowed their heads. Ethan wanted to disappear. His face was on fire. He remembered every sneer, every cruel word, every time he had felt powerful for making others laugh at another man's expense. Now all that power was gone. It had flipped on him, leaving him hollow, exposed, small. Mr. Thomas leaned slightly closer to the microphone, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a hammer. Respect must never be given to appearances. It must be given to the work behind them, to the sacrifice that built them, to the spirit that sustains them. Silence fell again, heavy and unbreakable. Even the youngest children, who could barely grasp the scale of what they were hearing, sensed that something sacred had just passed through the room. No one moved. No one dared to laugh. And in the stillness, Mr. Thomas stepped back from the podium. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He didn't explain further. He simply let silence speak for him, knowing it would echo louder than words ever could. And, for the first time in decades, the entire room looked at him with respect. But Ethan's lesson wasn't over, it had only just begun. The silence after Mr. Thomas's speech did not fade quickly. It lingered like a weight pressing down on the entire auditorium. The banners above the stage seemed to hang heavier. The polished wood of the floor looked darker, and every person in the room felt smaller beneath the truth they had just heard. For decades, the man in gray had walked past them unseen. Now, he stood revealed as the very foundation of Arden Hill Academy. The silence was no longer the silence of disregard. It was the silence of awe, the silence of respect. But silence has another power. It exposes guilt, and no one felt that guilt more than Ethan. In the front row, his face burned so hot it felt as if every eye in the room was fixed on him. His throat tightened. He could not breathe properly, could not sit still, could not escape the memory of his own voice, mocking, sneering, laughing. Every cruel word he had spoken came back to him now, louder in his own ears than Mr. Thomas' entire speech. Whispers began to stir. Students in the rows behind him leaned toward one another, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. "That's him. He's the one who always laughed. Remember the drawings? That was Ethan." His friends shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting anywhere but toward him. The safety of their laughter was gone. They could not protect him from the truth. Ethan's father sat beside him, stiff as stone, his jaw clenched, his hand gripping the armrest with white knuckles. He leaned closer, his voice a hiss. "Don't move. Don't speak. This will pass." But Ethan knew it would not pass. The shame was a living thing now, crawling under his skin, burning in his chest. He could feel the truth pressing against him like a hand between his shoulder blades, forcing him to stand. And then, from the middle rows, another voice broke the silence. It was Maya. She rose to her feet, her back straight, her chin high. Her voice, though young, carried clear and steady through the hall. "Mr. Rowan," she said, deliberately, respectfully, using his true name. "May I ask you something?" The headmaster stiffened, startled by the breach of protocol. But before he could object, Mr. Thomas lifted his hand gently, commanding the room with the simplest of gestures. "You may," he said. Maya's eyes did not waver. "When people mocked you," she asked, "when they laughed at your shoes, why did you never speak back? Why did you stay silent all these years?" A wave rippled through the crowd. Students leaned forward. Parents frowned. Teachers held their breath. And Ethan froze in his seat, his heart pounding. He knew this question was meant for him as much as it was for Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas looked at Maya, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Because silence," he said, "can teach louder than words. The one who mocks is rarely ready to hear the truth. So I let them hear their own laughter, until one day it rang hollow. The words struck the air like thunder, and in that thunder, Ethan felt his world split open. His laughter, the laughter that had once made him powerful, popular, untouchable, now came back to him empty, cruel, meaningless. The whispers behind him grew sharper. Students turned their eyes to him. The truth was no longer hidden. Everyone knew. His father's hand gripped his shoulder again, harder this time, a command to stay seated. But Ethan could not. He rose to his feet slowly, trembling, the motion alone pulling every gaze in the hall. The murmurs died. The silence returned, sharper than a knife. Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, but it carried anyway. I was one of them." The words echoed across the auditorium. Gasps followed. Heads turned. His friends shrank back, unwilling to be linked to him. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest heaving. "I laughed at your shoes. I mocked you. I thought you were nothing. I thought I was better." His throat burned, but he forced the last words out. "I was wrong." For a moment there was only silence, the kind that stretched and stretched until it seemed unbearable. Then, finally, Mr. Thomas spoke. "What matters," he said, his voice calm and steady, "is not that you mocked. What matters is that you now understand why it was wrong. Humility does not come from never stumbling. It comes from learning when you fall." The words pierced Ethan's heart like light breaking through clouds. His knees weakened, but he remained standing, his head bowed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't worried about how he looked. He only felt the weight of the truth and the strange, aching relief of finally admitting it. Mr. Thomas turned his gaze from Ethan back to the entire hall. His voice rose once more, filling the space. Let this day remind you, every person you pass carries a story. Some are written in books, some are written in silence. Respect them, because you may not know how deep their roots run what they have built beneath your feet. The applause that followed was unlike anything before. It rose not in politeness, not in ceremony, but in thunderous waves, students, teachers, parents, all clapping with something fierce in their hearts. And Ethan, standing amid it all, tears burning his eyes, knew that his life had changed forever. But the story of the shoes was not finished, because Mr. Thomas had saved one final truth-own last revelation that would leave the entire room breathless. The thunder of applause shook the auditorium walls, rolling and echoing like a storm that refused to pass. It wasn't polite clapping anymore, not the staged response of donors or the routine courtesy of parents at a ceremony. This was something different, fiercer, rawer. It was as though every pair of hands in the room needed to let out the weight they had just been carrying. Mr. Thomas stood at the podium, steady as ever, his expression calm, almost serene. He did not smile. He did not bow. He simply waited. Slowly, the applause died down, leaving behind a ringing silence that seemed to hum in the bones of every person present. He looked out across the rows, his eyes sharp, piercing, but not unkind. His voice, when it came, was softer than before, but it carried with ease. You have heard my story. You have heard what these walls were built upon. But there is one more truth you must know, one final reason why I kept these shoes all these years. A ripple of curiosity passed through the audience. Students leaned forward. Teachers held still. Even the parents, stiff in their polished suits, found themselves hanging on the words of the man they had once dismissed. Mr. Thomas stepped out from behind the podium. His shoes tapped softly against the stage, each step echoing louder than it should have. He stopped at the edge of the platform, closer to the students, closer to the eyes that had so often mocked him. When the school was finished, he said, I could have bought new shoes. I had the means. I had the chance. But I chose not to, because these shoes were more than leather. They were my reminder. He paused, lifting one foot slightly, showing the cracked sole, the stitching repaired time and again. His voice lowered, heavy with memory. Every scuff, every tear, every mark on them carried a lesson. They reminded me of the mud that nearly swallowed us on the first day. They reminded me of the long nights when no one else believed this school would survive. They reminded me of the weight of bricks on my shoulders, of sweat in my eyes, of work that had no guarantee of reward. The room was utterly still. His words wrapped around them like a cloak, heavy but warm. These shoes, he continued, taught me never to forget where I came from. They taught me to stay humble, no matter how high these walls rose. They taught me to measure worth not by shine, but by endurance, by what can survive the test of time. His eyes moved slowly over the audience. I wore them every day to remind myself that the foundation matters more than the tower, that the roots matter more than the branches, and that the measure of a man is not in how clean his shoes are, but in how far he is willing to walk in them. The words struck deep. Students stared at their own polished shoes with unease. Parents shifted in their seats, realizing how often they had judged by appearances. Teachers bowed their heads, some openly wiping tears. And Ethan felt as though the shoes on his own feet weighed 100 pounds. His chest burned, his shame raw, but beneath it all was a flicker of understanding. Mr. Thomas let the silence stretch, then delivered the final blow with a calm, steady voice. And that is why I never replaced them. Because respect must be earned with every step you take. And I wanted to remember every single day the steps that built this place. The hall erupted again, not in laughter, not in whispers, but in applause so thunderous it shook the very air. Students rose to their feet. Teachers followed. Parents, too. For the first time in the school's history, the janitor, the man with the broom, the man with the old shoes, was honored as he had always deserved. And yet, in the middle of the storm of applause, Ethan could not clap. His hands rested uselessly on his knees, his head bowed, his heart heavy. Because for him, the revelation was not just about shoes. It was about what he had failed to see, what he had mocked, and what he now knew he could never undo. But the revelation did not end in the assembly. What Mr. Thomas had said rippled outward through classrooms, through teachers, through parents, and soon the entire culture of the school began to shift. The assembly ended, but its echo did not fade. As the students filed out of the great hall, their footsteps seemed quieter, their chatter subdued. The usual bursts of laughter that followed any school event were absent. Instead, heads turned, whispers flowed, and every glance seemed to return again and again to the image of those old, worn shoes on the stage. In the corridors, students walked differently. Some kept their eyes lowered, lost in thought. Others looked at the janitorial staff with new awareness, a flicker of respect where once there had been indifference. Even the rowdiest boys, those who usually shoved and joked their way down the hallway, moved with restraint, their bravado tempered by something deeper. The teachers felt it too. They exchanged looks in the staff room that afternoon, eyes brighter, voices softer. Many had known pieces of Mr. Thomas's story, but few had grasped the full truth. Now they carried it like a secret flame, a reminder that teaching was not only about equations and essays, but about humility, endurance, and respect. Some resolved quietly to weave his lesson into their classrooms, not by lectures, but by example. Parents, too, were unsettled. Those who had once spoken with pride about donations and social connections now felt a quiet shame for having measured their worth by money. In hushed conversations, they admitted how blind they had been, how much they had underestimated the man they passed every morning at the gate. A few even approached Mr. Thomas afterward, awkwardly offering thanks, though words felt too small for what they had witnessed. And then there was Ethan, the boy who had once strutted through the halls, leader of laughter, master of ridicule, now walked with his head lowered. The same students who had once joined his mockery now avoided his eyes. The same friends who had drawn cartoons and whispered insults with him now distanced themselves, unwilling to be tied to his cruelty. Even the teachers who had once overlooked his arrogance now watched him with a different gaze, measured, waiting, wondering what he would do next. The sting of whispers followed him everywhere. That's him. The one who mocked Mr. Thomas, the one who laughed at the shoes. They weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. They clung to him like shadows. Ethan felt the weight of it with every step. The laughter that had once filled him with power now rang hollow in his memory. The drawings he had sketched in arrogance now seemed childish and cruel. The pride he had carried so easily was gone, stripped away, leaving only the ache of shame. Yet beneath the shame, something new stirred. A seed. A quiet awareness that maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of him, but the beginning of something else. For the rest of the week, the school seemed transformed. Students picked up trash in the courtyard without being asked. They greeted the cleaning staff with nods and hesitant thank yous. Teachers noticed fewer disruptions in class, more listening, more reflection. Even small gestures, doors held open, books shared. Voices lowered seemed to ripple outward, each one a quiet tribute to the man who had walked unseen among them for so long. The shoes, those battered old shoes, became a symbol. Students spoke of them in hushed tones. Some even sketched them in notebooks, not as jokes, but as reminders. They whispered stories of Mr. Thomas' past, stories half remembered, half invented, but all spoken with respect. And in the center of it all, Mr. Thomas continued his work as he always had, sweeping the floors, fixing the lights, carrying buckets and tools. But now, every eye that passed him saw not a janitor, but the founder. Not a servant, but a builder. Not a man in old shoes, but the man whose steps had shaped their future. But for Ethan, the whispers, the stares, and the weight of his guilt reached a breaking point. And soon he would have to face Mr. Thomas himself. For days after the assembly, Ethan carried the whispers like chains. No hallway was safe, no classroom free of stares. The weight of what he had done pressed on him relentlessly, and no matter where he turned, he found himself face to face with his own guilt. It wasn't only the whispers of classmates that haunted him, it was the silence. Friends who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his eyes. Teachers who once overlooked his arrogance now studied him with quiet caution. Even his father's stern voice at home, usually filled with commands and expectations, had turned into cold silence. But the heaviest burden came not from others, but from within. Ethan replayed that moment in the assembly over and over, the sound of his own voice confessing, "I was one of them." The memory cut deep, but what cut even deeper was the image of Mr. Thomas's shoes, worn, cracked, sacred. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, they stood before him like a mirror, reflecting not just the founder's humility, but Ethan's own foolishness. By the end of the week, he could bear it no longer. The whispers, the shame, the memory of his mockery. They drove him to a single choice. He had to face Mr. Thomas. He had to speak the words he should have spoken long ago. It was late afternoon when Ethan found him. The halls were nearly empty, the sun casting long shadows through the windows. Mr. Thomas was in the west wing, mop in hand, working as if nothing had changed. His movements were steady, unhurried, the same as they had always been. Ethan froze at the doorway, his chest tight. For a long moment, he simply watched the man who had built the school, the man who had endured his mockery, moving quietly through the halls as though he belonged more than anyone else. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. His voice shook. "Mr. Thomas?" The older man paused, lifting his head. His eyes met Ethan's calm, steady, unreadable. "Yes, son?" Ethan swallowed hard. The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. "I came to say I am sorry for everything, for the jokes, the drawings, the laughter, for thinking I was better than you, for not seeing who you were, for not respecting you." His voice cracked. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." Silence stretched between them. Ethan's face burned. His eyes stung. He braced himself for anger, for disappointment, for the crushing weight of judgment. But Mr. Thomas only studied him for a moment, then leaned the mop gently against the wall. His voice, when it came, was calm but strong, carrying the same quiet power it had on the stage. "Respect," he said, "is the only currency that never loses its value." Ethan blinked, the words sinking into him. Mr. Thomas continued. "Shoes wear out, titles fade, Money comes and goes. But respect the kind built on humility, on kindness, on seeing the worth in others that will carry you farther than anything else. Remember that, son, and spend it wisely. The words wrapped around Ethan like a balm and a blade at once. His shame remained, but alongside it was something new, a seed of hope, a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." Mr. Thomas gave a small nod in return. Then, without ceremony, he picked up the mop and returned to his work. To him, the conversation was finished. The lesson was given. Ethan stood there for a long time, the sound of the mop swishing across the floor echoing in his ears. He understood now. He understood that greatness was not in the shine of shoes, but in the steps taken while wearing them. And from that day forward, Ethan would never see the world or a pair of shoes the same way again.